April 3, 1904. USS Brooklyn, Philippine waters. The wireless room stank of ozone and burning insulation. Radio man third class. Marcus Webb crouched before the equipment rack, watching voltage needles swing wildly across their brass faces while the spark gap transmitter discharged in irregular, chaotic bursts. The radio was dying, or so every manual, every instructor, every experienced operator would have concluded. 6 weeks at sea, tropical humidity penetrating every seal and gasket, salt air corroding connections faster than maintenance could restore them. The apparatus belonged in the repair depot, not the ship's communication suite. But Webb heard something in the chaos. Between the erratic discharges underneath the interference pattern spreading across frequencies like oil on water, existed structure. The malfunctioning transmitter wasn't simply failing. It was broadcasting across multiple wavelengths simultaneously, creating a noise blanket that drowned legitimate signals within its range. When the battleship squadron conducted communication drills that morning, ships within 2 miles of Brooklyn reported garbled, unintelligible reception. Not silence, not clarity, interference. Webb's hand hovered over the circuit breaker. Protocol demanded he shut down malfunctioning equipment immediately. Instead, he reached for his logbook and began documenting what the broken radio was teaching him about a capability the United States Navy had never imagined it might need. Naval wireless telegraphy in 1904 existed in technological infancy, barely a decade beyond Marconi's initial demonstrations. The apparatus remained mysterious to most officers, viewed with suspicion by captains who'd spent careers mastering visual signals and understood electromagnetic propagation only as theoretical abstraction. Radio operators occupied ambiguous positions, technical specialists whose expertise contradicted traditional naval hierarchy, enlisted men who possessed knowledge their commanding officers lacked. The equipment itself reflected this developmental state. Spark gap transmitters operated on principles more mechanical than electrical: rotating contacts, high voltage discharges across air gaps, crude tuning accomplished by adjusting coil inductance and capacitance values. Each transmission created broadband electromagnetic noise, theoretically centered on a specific frequency, but practically splashing across adjacent wavelengths like shouting in a crowded room. Receivers equally primitive employed coherer detectors, glass tubes filled with metal filings that conducted electricity when struck by radio waves, requiring physical tapping to restore sensitivity after each signal reception. The Navy's wireless doctrine, such as it existed, focused entirely on communication, transmitting orders, reporting positions, coordinating fleet movements. The strategic implications remained largely unexplored. Wireless provided advantage over visual signals: extended range, all-weather capability, reduced dependence on line of sight. But this advantage cut both ways. If American ships could communicate via wireless, so could adversaries. And unlike visual signals, which remained confined by horizon and weather, radio waves propagated omnidirectionally, potentially intercepted by any receiver within range. Webb understood these limitations intimately. He'd spent 18 months as radio operator, first at shore stations, then aboard Brooklyn. He'd witnessed communication failures during fleet exercises, watched commanders abandon wireless in frustration and revert to signal flags. The technology promised transformation but delivered inconsistency. Atmospheric conditions affected propagation unpredictably. Equipment malfunctioned in ways mechanics trained on conventional machinery couldn't diagnose. The electromagnetic spectrum remained unmapped territory, its properties understood through experimentation rather than established science. The malfunctioning transmitter represented failure according to every operational standard. It couldn't send coherent messages. It consumed power without producing useful communication. Yet Webb recognized something orthodox thinking missed. Failure in one context could constitute capability in another. The broken radio's interference pattern, which destroyed friendly communications, would equally destroy enemy communications, if properly employed. The chaotic discharge that made the transmitter useless for messaging made it potentially invaluable for something the Navy had never formally conceptualized: deliberate signal disruption. He needed to prove the concept before equipment condemnation procedures consigned the malfunctioning apparatus to the salvage depot. Webb's initial experiments occurred during off-watch hours, unauthorized tests conducted while senior officers slept, and official communication schedules remained inactive. He isolated the malfunctioning transmitter's power supply, adjusting voltage and timing to control interference intensity. The results proved immediately observable. At low power settings, the interference created minor signal degradation. Messages remained intelligible, but required repetition. At higher settings, the noise blanket completely obscured legitimate transmissions within the affected frequency range. The technical revelation came when Webb realized the malfunction involved not component failure, but unintended resonance. A cracked capacitor, combined with corroded spark gap contacts, created oscillation patterns that distributed transmission energy across much wider bandwidth than normal operation produced. The broken component became, accidentally, a primitive frequency hopping mechanism. The transmitter's signal jumped erratically across adjacent wavelengths, creating interference that conventional receivers, tuned to specific frequencies, couldn't filter effectively. He documented everything meticulously: power settings, interference range, frequency distribution patterns, effects on various receiver types. The logbook accumulated technical data supporting conclusion that would sound absurd to senior officers. The broken radio worked better for disruption than functional radios worked for communication. The malfunction's unpredictability, which made the transmitter useless for messaging, made it extraordinarily effective for jamming. Receivers couldn't compensate for interference that changed frequency continuously, because early wireless equipment lacked the tuning flexibility for rapid adjustment. Webb faced bureaucratic obstacles before tactical ones. Reporting his discovery required explaining why he'd continued operating malfunctioning equipment instead of following protocols demanding immediate shutdown. He'd violated regulations conducting unauthorized experiments with ships' communication systems. The technical insight that broken equipment possessed alternative utility contradicted fundamental assumptions about equipment maintenance and operational procedures. Navy culture valued discipline and adherence to established protocol. Webb was proposing that sometimes breaking rules revealed capabilities rules following obscured. The strategic implications, if anyone bothered considering them, proved equally uncomfortable. Deliberate signal disruption suggested offensive electronic warfare, using radio not to communicate but to prevent enemy communication. This concept existed nowhere in naval doctrine. Worse, it implied vulnerability. If Americans could disrupt enemy communications, enemies could disrupt American communications. Acknowledging jamming capability meant acknowledging jamming vulnerability, forcing uncomfortable questions about wireless telegraphy's reliability in combat conditions. Webb drafted his report knowing it might end his naval career. He was junior enlisted man proposing tactical innovation to officers who barely understood the technology involved. But the broken radio had revealed something important, and allowing that knowledge to die through bureaucratic inertia seemed worse than whatever personal consequences might follow. The report went up the chain of command on April 15, 1904. Lieutenant Commander Harrison Pierce received Webb's report with skepticism approaching hostility. Pierce commanded Brooklyn's Communication Division, responsible for all wireless operations, and junior radio men submitting unsolicited tactical proposals represented precisely the sort of breach in discipline that undermined good order. The report sat unread on Pierce's desk for 3 days before administrative backlog forced him to review it between more pressing matters. The technical documentation changed his assessment. Webb had produced data, not speculation. The interference patterns were measurable, reproducible, documented with scientific rigor, unusual for enlisted personnel. Pierce understood enough about wireless propagation to recognize the implications. If one malfunctioning transmitter could disrupt communications across an entire squadron, hostile forces with deliberately designed jamming equipment could paralyze American naval coordination. The vulnerability demanded investigation, even if the capability offered questionable utility. Pierce scheduled a demonstration for April 22 during routine fleet communication exercises. The timing allowed testing Webb's claims without disrupting operational schedules or attracting attention from higher command authorities who might disapprove of experimental wireless employment. Brooklyn would attempt to jam communications between other squadron vessels using the malfunctioning transmitter. If Webb's documentation proved accurate, messages between those ships would become unintelligible, while Brooklyn's interference operated. If his claims were exaggerated, the exercise would waste one morning and confirm the equipment required condemnation. Webb prepared the apparatus with meticulous attention. The damaged capacitor remained installed. Replacing it would eliminate the resonance creating broadband interference. He adjusted spark gap spacing to optimize discharge characteristics, calibrated power supply to deliver consistent voltage, tested receiver sensitivity across multiple frequencies to establish baseline signal strength before jamming commenced. The technical preparations consumed hours, supervised by Pierce, who gradually recognized that Webb possessed expertise far beyond typical radio man training. The young enlisted man understood electromagnetic theory at level suggesting formal education or extraordinary self-study. The demonstration began at 600 hours. Brooklyn activated the malfunctioning transmitter at low power, while USS Oregon attempted to transmit routine position report to squadron flagship. Oregon's signal, normally clear at 12-mile range, arrived garbled and incomplete. Brooklyn increased power. Oregon's next transmission became completely unintelligible, overwhelmed by interference that sounded like continuous static, punctuated by random crackles. The flagship requested Oregon repeat the message. Oregon complied. The result remained identical, noise obscuring all content. Pierce ordered the interference ceased. Oregon's subsequent transmission arrived with perfect clarity. The broken radio had just demonstrated capability that would fundamentally alter naval warfare's electromagnetic dimension. Neither Pierce nor Webb yet understood the implications, but both recognized they'd crossed some threshold from which there was no return to previous innocence about wireless vulnerability. News of Brooklyn's demonstration propagated through the Navy's technical community, with velocity exceeding the wireless signals themselves. Officers who understood radio's strategic potential recognized jamming capabilities' profound implications immediately. If electromagnetic signals could be deliberately disrupted, wireless telegraphy's reliability, already questionable in operational conditions, became actively compromised in contested environments. Every communication system the Navy had begun depending upon existed within an adversary's potential targeting envelope. The reaction split along predictable fault lines. Traditional officers, skeptical of wireless from the beginning, viewed jamming capability as confirmation that radio remained unreliable toy, unsuited for serious naval operations. Signal flags couldn't be jammed. Visual semaphore worked regardless of enemy electronic capabilities. Electromagnetic communications vulnerability proved its unsuitability for combat employment. These officers recommended limiting wireless to auxiliary status, maintaining visual communication primacy for tactical coordination. Technically progressive officers reached opposite conclusions. Jamming capability meant electronic warfare had emerged as new combat dimension. The Navy needed to develop both offensive jamming systems and defensive anti-jamming techniques. Wireless communication was too valuable to abandon simply because adversaries might disrupt it. The appropriate response involved innovation, frequency hopping protocols, directional antennas, higher power transmitters that could overcome interference, receiver designs with better selectivity and noise rejection. The vulnerability demanded solution, not retreat to obsolete communication methods. Webb found himself unexpectedly central to debates far above his rank. Senior officers summoned him to explain technical details, demonstrate interference techniques, theorize about countermeasures. The experience proved simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. He was enlisted radio man offering tactical advice to captains and admirals, explaining electromagnetic propagation to men whose understanding of physics ended at Newtonian mechanics. Some officers engaged respectfully, recognizing expertise regardless of rank. Others dismissed him with barely concealed contempt. Enlisted men advising officers violated fundamental hierarchy principles. The philosophical implications troubled Webb more than bureaucratic friction. He'd discovered jamming capability accidentally, through equipment malfunction nobody intended. But now that knowledge existed, it couldn't be unknown. And if Americans possessed this knowledge, adversaries would develop it independently. The electromagnetic spectrum, which had seemed limitless resource for communication, was actually contested territory where signals fought for space, and every transmission became potential target. Webb had helped inaugurate an era of electronic warfare he understood only dimly, watching dominoes fall toward consequences nobody could fully anticipate. The Navy established a formal electronic warfare study board in June 1904, tasked with investigating jamming techniques, countermeasures, and operational employment doctrine. Webb received orders transferring him to the board as technical specialist, extraordinary assignment for junior enlisted man that reflected how desperately the Navy needed expertise that didn't yet exist within its officer corps. The study board's work revealed electromagnetic warfare's complexity, extending far beyond simple signal disruption. As researchers experimented with jamming techniques, they simultaneously discovered vulnerabilities in their own communication systems and began developing countermeasures that adversaries could presumably also develop. The technological arms race began before the first shot of deliberate electronic combat had been fired, each innovation spawning counter-innovation in perpetual escalation. Webb's broken radio, while effective for demonstrating jamming concept, proved inadequate for systematic electronic warfare. The malfunction's randomness, initially advantageous, prevented precise control over interference characteristics. The board needed purpose-built jamming equipment with adjustable frequency, controllable power output, and reliable operation. Navy engineers designed new apparatus based on Webb's documentation, but engineered for deliberate interference rather than accidental malfunction. The prototype transmitters could sweep across frequency ranges, concentrate energy on specific wavelengths, or create broadband noise blankets depending on tactical requirements. Operational questions proved more challenging than technical ones. When should jamming be employed? Disrupting enemy communications seemed obviously valuable, but jamming was non-discriminatory. It affected all receivers within range, including friendly forces. Fleet operations required coordination. Jamming enemy signals while maintaining friendly communications demanded careful frequency management, which required knowing what frequencies enemies employed. This meant intelligence gathering, signal interception, traffic analysis, entire infrastructure of electronic surveillance that didn't exist in 1904. The diplomatic implications created additional complications. International law governing naval warfare said nothing about radio jamming because wireless communication was too new for legal frameworks to address. Was electronic interference an act of war? Could jamming be employed during peacetime tensions without triggering open conflict? If adversaries jammed American communications during naval exercises in international waters, what response was appropriate? The legal ambiguity troubled Navy lawyers tasked with ensuring operations complied with international conventions. Webb found himself drafted into developing training curricula for electronic warfare operators. The Navy needed personnel who understood both technical operation and tactical employment. Radio operators required new skills: signal analysis, frequency management, interference pattern recognition, jamming technique selection. The training evolved from nothing. No established doctrine, no experienced instructors, no institutional knowledge beyond what Webb and the study board generated through experimentation. They were inventing entire military specialty from first principles, creating knowledge that would eventually fill libraries, but currently existed only in logbooks and experimental reports. By late 1904, the Navy had developed prototype jamming equipment, rudimentary employment doctrine, and small cadre of operators trained in electronic warfare fundamentals. What began as one broken radio had metastasized into systematic capability that would fundamentally alter naval combat's electromagnetic dimension. Webb's accidental discovery had launched an arms race that would continue throughout the 20th century and beyond. The moral dimensions of electronic warfare emerged slowly, disguised initially as technical and tactical questions, but Webb couldn't escape uncomfortable recognition. Jamming communications in combat meant sailors died because orders never arrived, because distress signals went unheard, because coordination collapsed into chaos. Unlike guns that killed directly and visibly, electronic warfare murdered through confusion and isolation. Ships sank because jamming prevented damage reports from reaching rescue vessels. Men drowned because interference blocked calls for assistance. The weapon was invisible, its effects indirect, but the casualties were real. The study board wrestled with these implications during theoretical wargaming exercises. Scenarios involving electronic warfare rapidly escalated into disasters disproportionate to physical force employed. In one simulation, jamming prevented a squadron from coordinating defensive maneuvers against submarine attack, resulting in hypothetical loss of 3 battleships. In another, electronic interference disrupted communication between fleet and shore command during amphibious landing, causing invasion force to withdraw unnecessarily, believing support had been canceled. The simulations demonstrated that electronic warfare's power lay not in destruction, but in creating uncertainty, fear, and paralysis. Webb proposed guidelines distinguishing legitimate military interference from what he considered electronic atrocities. Jamming tactical communications in active combat seemed clearly acceptable. Disrupting distress signals from sinking ships seemed clearly criminal. Between those extremes lay vast gray area. Jamming during peacetime tensions, interfering with commercial shipping communications, disrupting neutral nation signals during wartime operations. The study board's recommendations attempted to establish ethical framework, but Webb recognized the futility. Once capability existed, employment restraints would erode under operational pressures. The technology's impersonal nature troubled him most deeply. Firing guns required seeing targets, accepting visceral reality of violence inflicted. Electronic warfare happened at distance, mediated through instruments, killing through absence rather than presence. Operators never saw consequences of their interference. The confusion, the panic, the deaths resulting from communications failure. The psychological insulation made electronic warfare easier to employ than kinetic weapons, which meant it would be employed more readily, with less hesitation, across lower thresholds of conflict. Senior officers dismissed Webb's ethical concerns as excessive scruples inappropriate for military personnel. War involved killing enemies through whatever means proved effective. Electronic warfare simply added new dimension to eternal struggle, no more morally problematic than blockades that starved civilian populations or naval bombardments that destroyed coastal cities. Webb couldn't articulate why jamming felt different, why invisible interference seemed more troubling than visible destruction, but the unease persisted, growing stronger as the study board's work progressed toward operational deployment. He'd broken the radio. He'd discovered the capability. He bore responsibility for consequences he couldn't prevent and didn't fully understand. By 1905, electronic warfare had evolved from theoretical concept to operational capability. The Navy installed purpose-built jamming equipment aboard capital ships, trained operators in interference techniques, and incorporated electronic attack into fleet exercise scenarios. The transition from experimentation to deployment revealed limitations laboratory testing had obscured. Jamming proved devastatingly effective under ideal conditions, but unreliable in operational complexity. Atmospheric propagation varied unpredictably. Equipment malfunctioned under combat stress. Operators made errors distinguishing friendly from enemy signals. The capability existed, but employment doctrine remained immature. The Russo-Japanese War provided brutal education in electronic warfare's combat realities. Both sides employed wireless telegraphy extensively, and both attempted signal disruption with varying success. Japanese forces particularly embraced jamming as tactical weapon, disrupting Russian naval communications during critical phases of the Tsushima Strait battle. Russian operators reported widespread interference, making coordination nearly impossible during the engagement's decisive moments. Post-battle analysis suggested electronic warfare contributed to Russia's catastrophic defeat as significantly as superior Japanese gunnery and tactics. American naval observers studying Tsushima recognized electronic warfare had transcended theoretical status. The battle demonstrated that electromagnetic disruption could influence combat outcomes decisively. Ships equipped with jamming capability possessed advantage over those dependent solely on uncontested wireless communication. The strategic implications cascaded rapidly. Navies needed electronic warfare capacity, but they also needed electronic warfare defenses. The arms race Webb's broken radio accelerated dramatically. The Navy expanded electronic warfare programs accordingly. New transmitter designs increased jamming effectiveness. Receiver modifications improved signal selectivity and interference rejection. Communication protocols incorporated frequency hopping and encryption primitives intended to complicate enemy interception and jamming. The technical evolution proceeded rapidly, driven by recognition that electromagnetic superiority would determine naval dominance in future conflicts. Webb, promoted to Chief Radio Man and assigned permanent position with the Electronic Warfare Development Office, watched the acceleration with mixed emotions. His discovery had proven strategically significant. The Navy now possessed capability that might save American lives in future conflicts. But capability invited employment. Electronic warfare doctrine evolved toward increasingly aggressive postures, jamming not merely in combat but during peacetime tensions, interfering with neutral shipping to complicate enemy logistics, disrupting commercial communications to create economic pressure. The escalation seemed inevitable once the threshold was crossed from communication to disruption, from information sharing to information denial. He remembered the broken radio, the chaotic discharges, the accidental discovery that changed everything. Innovation always carried unintended consequences. The question was whether those consequences, once visible, could be guided toward beneficial outcomes, or whether they possessed momentum, independent of human intention. Webb suspected the latter but continued working toward the former, because abandoning the effort guaranteed the worst outcomes would manifest unchallenged. Intelligence convergence revealed Webb's discovery had parallels in other navies' development programs. British, German, and French technical services had all recognized wireless communications vulnerability to deliberate interference. Multiple nations simultaneously developed jamming capabilities through independent paths, suggesting the technology possessed inevitable quality. Once wireless communication existed, signal disruption would follow with logical certainty. The electromagnetic spectrum was contested territory from the moment multiple actors began employing it for communication. This revelation complicated strategic calculations. American electronic warfare capabilities provided no unique advantage if adversaries possessed equivalent systems. Worse, jamming's non-discriminatory nature meant electromagnetic warfare might disadvantage communicative-dependent American forces more than adversaries with established doctrine for operating under communication denial. Japanese naval tactics, emphasizing individual commander initiative and pre-established battle plans, proved relatively resilient to communication disruption. American doctrine, depending heavily on centralized command and coordination, collapsed more dramatically when wireless communications failed. The Navy's response involved doctrinal evolution as much as technical development. New operational procedures assumed communication would be contested, potentially denied entirely during critical phases. Commanders received training in operating under electromagnetic warfare conditions, making decisions with incomplete information, coordinating through prearranged signals and contingency plans rather than real-time wireless direction. The cultural shift proved challenging for Navy accustomed to communication-enabled centralized control. Electronic warfare forced organizational adaptation toward decentralized execution, precisely what traditional naval hierarchy resisted. Webb's role evolved from technical specialist to strategic advisor. Senior officers sought his perspective on electromagnetic warfare's broader implications, how it would reshape naval tactics, what organizational changes were necessary, how to prepare for combat environments where wireless communication couldn't be assumed reliable. He found himself arguing positions far beyond his original expertise, extrapolating from technical understanding to strategic vision. The responsibilities sometimes overwhelmed him. He was enlisted man helping shape naval doctrine that would influence conflicts decades hence. The international dimension added complexity. Naval powers began discussing electromagnetic warfare's legal status, attempting to establish treaties limiting jamming employment, similar to agreements restricting other weapon types. The negotiations revealed fundamental disagreement about whether electronic interference constituted legitimate combat tactic or illegitimate attack on communication infrastructure. Some nations argued jamming should be prohibited during peacetime entirely. Others maintained that electromagnetic spectrum management was sovereign right, and nations could employ radio frequencies however they chose. The legal ambiguity persisted, leaving electronic warfare in doctrinal gray zone where capability existed, but employment rules remained contested. Webb watched nations stumble toward electronic warfare's implications, each discovering independently what his broken radio had taught him years earlier. The electromagnetic spectrum was battlespace, and control of that battlespace would determine victory or defeat in future conflicts increasingly dependent on information dominance. By 1907, electronic warfare had matured from experimental capability to integrated component of naval operations. The transformation reflected broader shifts in warfare's character. Conflicts increasingly involved information as much as materiel, electromagnetic dominance as much as firepower superiority. Webb's broken radio had helped inaugurate this transition, though he sometimes wondered if acceleration would have occurred regardless, driven by technological evolution's internal logic rather than individual discoveries. The Navy's Electronic Warfare Office, grown from small study board into substantial bureaucratic entity, developed comprehensive doctrine for electromagnetic operations. The guidelines covered offensive jamming, defensive countermeasures, signals intelligence, communication security, and electromagnetic spectrum management. What began as simple interference had evolved into complex operational domain, requiring specialized expertise, dedicated equipment, and sophisticated coordination. Modern naval vessels carried electronic warfare suites as standard equipment, operated by trained specialists who understood electromagnetic propagation as thoroughly as gunners understood ballistics. Preparation for potential conflict with Japan, increasingly likely as tensions escalated over Pacific influence, incorporated electronic warfare as central element. American war plans assumed Japanese forces would employ aggressive jamming, attempting to blind American communications while protecting their own networks. Countering this required technical solutions, more resilient communication systems, and tactical adaptations, operating effectively under communication denial. Fleet exercises incorporated electronic warfare scenarios with increasing realism, forcing commanders to experience coordination breakdown and develop responses under stress, rather than discovering vulnerabilities during actual combat. Webb received orders to command the Navy's first dedicated electronic warfare vessel, USS Charleston, fitted with advanced jamming equipment and serving as floating laboratory for testing new techniques. The assignment represented extraordinary recognition for enlisted man, reflecting how thoroughly electronic warfare had disrupted traditional naval hierarchy. Expertise mattered more than rank when the expertise was rare enough and critical enough. Webb accepted the position knowing it would generate resentment from officers who believed enlisted personnel should not hold command positions, but he also recognized the opportunity to shape capability he'd helped create. Charleston's mission combined operational employment and continued development. The vessel would participate in fleet exercises, providing realistic electronic warfare opposition that would test American communication resilience. Simultaneously, Charleston would experiment with new jamming techniques, interference patterns, and countermeasure systems. The dual role made Charleston unique in the fleet, part combatant, part research platform, existing at intersection of current capability and future potential. As Webb took command in April 1907, he reflected on the journey from broken radio to operational command. 3 years from malfunction to mission, from accidental discovery to systematic capability. The velocity of change felt dizzying, suggesting future warfare would evolve at speeds beyond traditional military institutions' ability to adapt. The confrontation arrived not through formal conflict, but through escalating tensions that pushed electronic warfare from training exercise to operational employment. American and Japanese naval forces, conducting parallel maneuvers in disputed Pacific waters, began aggressively jamming each other's communications during exercises that were barely disguised reconnaissance missions. Neither side acknowledged the interference, but both understood the message. Electromagnetic warfare had transitioned from theoretical capability to practical weapon in the undeclared conflict preceding potential open war. Charleston participated in these operations directly. Webb commanded jamming missions designed to disrupt Japanese naval communications while testing American resilience to countermeasures. The operations existed in legal gray zone, not acts of war, but certainly not peaceful navigation. Electronic interference in international waters fell outside existing treaties, creating space where aggression could occur without triggering formal conflict. The electromagnetic spectrum became arena for demonstrating capabilities, signaling resolve, and probing adversary weaknesses. The psychological impact exceeded physical effects. Japanese commanders, discovering their communications jammed by American vessels, understood the Americans possessed electronic warfare capability, at least equivalent to their own. The revelation undermined Japanese confidence in planned operations, depending on electromagnetic surprise. If Americans could jam Japanese communications, they could also intercept Japanese signals, analyze Japanese traffic patterns, potentially break Japanese codes. Electronic warfare's existence implied entire intelligence apparatus that might compromise operational security completely. Webb experienced the contradiction inherent in deterrence through capability demonstration. Charleston's jamming missions aimed to prevent war by showing Japan that American electronic warfare capabilities made Japanese war plans unworkable, but demonstrating capability required employing it aggressively in ways that escalated tensions and could trigger the conflict they intended to prevent. Electronic warfare existed in paradox, too effective to ignore, too provocative to employ freely, creating instability while theoretically maintaining peace through demonstrated power. Individual moments from these operations haunted Webb afterward. Jamming Japanese distress signals from merchant vessel experiencing engine trouble, because distinguishing legitimate emergencies from tactical deception proved impossible in operational conditions. Interfering with Japanese naval communications during typhoon, when coordination meant survival, because standing down would signal weakness. The moral compromises accumulate, each justified by strategic necessity, each eroding ethical boundaries supposedly governing warfare. Electronic warfare's invisible nature made these choices easier. Webb never saw the consequences, never watched ships founder because jamming prevented coordination, never counted bodies resulting from interference that caused confusion at critical moments. But he knew they existed. The electromagnetic spectrum was battlefield, and battlefields produced casualties regardless of whether weapons drew blood directly or killed through absence of information that might have saved lives. The culmination arrived not in decisive battle, but in recognition that electronic warfare had fundamentally altered naval operations permanently. By 1909, every major navy operated electronic warfare capabilities. The electromagnetic spectrum was completely militarized, communications assumed contested, information operations integrated into standard tactical doctrine. Webb's broken radio had revealed capability that, once known, could not be suppressed or ignored. The genie had left the bottle, and military organizations worldwide were adapting to electromagnetic warfare's reality. The transformation's depth became clear during war games simulating major fleet engagement. Communications collapsed almost immediately under mutual jamming, forcing reversion to visual signals and prearranged plans. Commanders discovered they couldn't coordinate multi-ship maneuvers in real time, couldn't respond to tactical developments flexibly, couldn't exploit opportunities that required immediate communication. Electronic warfare didn't merely complicate naval operations, it fundamentally changed what was possible tactically. Doctrine developed around wireless communication capability became obsolete when that capability was denied. The Navy's response involved philosophical shift as dramatic as technological adaptation. Centralized command proved impossible under electronic warfare conditions. Decentralized execution became necessity. Individual commanders required greater initiative authority, broader discretion, deeper understanding of strategic objectives so they could adapt tactics independently when communication failed. The organizational transformation challenged naval culture built around hierarchy and centralized control, forcing evolution toward structures that could function effectively despite electromagnetic disruption. Webb watched this transformation with complex emotions. His discovery had proven more consequential than imagined that morning in Brooklyn's wireless room. Electronic warfare had changed naval operations fundamentally, forcing tactical, technical, and organizational adaptations across every major navy. The capability mattered, but the price troubled him increasingly. Electronic warfare accelerated toward total information denial, toward electromagnetic environments so contested that wireless communication became impossible, toward returning to visual signals and rigid pre-battle planning, despite possessing communication technology that should have enabled coordination flexibility. The irony seemed profound. Wireless telegraphy promised to revolutionize naval operations by enabling real-time communication across vast distances, but electronic warfare's emergence threatened to make that promise unrealizable in combat conditions. The technology existed, the capability was real, but mutual jamming meant neither side could fully exploit wireless communications potential. They'd created electromagnetic Mexican standoff where everyone possessed capability that became useless once everyone else possessed it too. The broken radio had taught that lesson first. Sometimes capability exists most powerfully, as threat, as potential, as deterrent. Once employed, once normalized, once countered, the capability's value diminishes even as its effects proliferate. Webb understood now what he'd unleashed, and the knowledge provided neither satisfaction nor regret, only recognition of innovation's inevitable character, always transformative, always irreversible, always carrying consequences beyond original intentions. The revelation arrived gradually rather than explosively, accumulated across years of watching electronic warfare, mature from novelty to norm. Webb recognized that the broken radio's deepest lesson wasn't about jamming or interference or tactical employment. It was about innovation's nature itself. Capability, once demonstrated, propagates inevitably. Knowledge cannot be unlearned. Techniques cannot be uninvented. The discovery trajectory moves one direction, from ignorance to knowledge, from absence to capability, from potential to employment. Electronic warfare embodied this principle absolutely. Every Navy developed jamming capability independently because the physics was accessible to anyone working with wireless communications. The technical knowledge required was straightforward: create broadband noise, overwhelm receiver sensitivity, disrupt signal detection. Webb's contribution wasn't unique genius but temporal priority. He recognized the possibility first, documented it systematically, demonstrated it convincingly. But if he hadn't, someone else would have within months or years. The capability existed latently within wireless technology itself, waiting for recognition. This understanding transformed Webb's perspective on his own role. He hadn't created electronic warfare. He'd midwifed its birth. The broken radio was symptom, not cause. Electromagnetic warfare emerged inevitably from wireless communications' existence because communication channels are inherently vulnerable to disruption. The only question was timing. When would recognition occur and who would achieve it first? Webb happened to be the person, and 1904 happened to be the moment. But the convergence was almost arbitrary. The capability would have emerged regardless. The moral implications of this recognition proved more troubling than the technical ones. If electronic warfare was inevitable, individual responsibility for its consequences became ambiguous. Webb couldn't be blamed for discovering capability that anyone would have discovered eventually, but he also couldn't be absolved. His actions had accelerated electronic warfare's deployment, launching arms race that might have proceeded slower or developed differently under alternative circumstances. The inevitability didn't eliminate agency, only contextualized it within larger technological trajectories beyond individual control. Standing on Charleston's Bridge in 1910, watching electronic warfare exercises that would have seemed impossible 6 years prior, Webb confronted the question that haunted every innovator. If capability is inevitable, does that make its discovery less consequential or more? If someone would have found it eventually, does being first matter? He'd broken the radio, recognized what the malfunction revealed, and changed naval warfare permanently. The electromagnetic spectrum would remain battlespace forever. Contested territory where information struggled against interference, where communication fought denial, where every signal faced potential disruption. The furniture wood had defeated aluminum through elegant simplicity. The broken radio had revealed capability through malfunction. Innovation arrived through unexpected paths, wearing disguises conventional wisdom couldn't penetrate, teaching lessons orthodoxy wasn't prepared to learn. Marcus Webb retired from the Navy in 1924 as commander, extraordinary achievement for sailor who'd entered service as enlisted radioman. His career spanned wireless telegraphy's evolution, from experimental curiosity to essential capability, from communication tool to contested battlespace. He'd witnessed electronic warfare mature from accidental discovery to systematic doctrine, from individual innovation to institutional capability. The broken radio that launched this transformation had long since been salvaged for parts, its components recycled into newer equipment, its physical form erased even as its legacy persisted. Electronic warfare's subsequent development vindicated Webb's early insights while revealing implications he'd only dimly perceived. World War I demonstrated electromagnetic operations' combat significance. World War II elevated electronic warfare to strategic priority equal to air superiority or naval dominance. The Cold War pushed competition into space-based systems and computer-controlled jamming that would have seemed fantastic to operators struggling with spark-gap transmitters in 1904. The trajectory from Webb's broken radio to modern cyber warfare traced continuous line, each innovation building on previous capabilities, each advancement enabling further evolution, the progression seemingly infinite. The human stories endured beyond the technology. Naval officers who initially dismissed Webb's proposal, then later championed electronic warfare development. Radiomen who mastered jamming techniques through experimentation and shared knowledge informally before formal training programs existed. Adversary operators who developed countermeasures that pushed American capabilities toward greater sophistication. The individuals whose creativity, persistence, and willingness to question orthodoxy drove electronic warfare's evolution from impossibility to commonplace. Webb himself rarely discussed the broken radio in later years. When asked about electronic warfare's origins during retirement interviews, he emphasized collaborative development over individual discovery, institutional support over personal initiative. But historians studying naval innovation understood his contribution's significance. The broken radio episode demonstrated how capability could emerge from failure, how malfunction could reveal possibility, how maintaining curiosity about anomalies could unlock knowledge orthodox approaches missed. Webb hadn't been trying to invent electronic warfare. He'd simply noticed something unusual, investigated systematically, and documented findings honestly. That approach, observing carefully, thinking critically, communicating clearly, transcended the specific technical discovery. It represented innovation methodology applicable across domains. Remain alert to unexpected phenomena. Investigate anomalies rather than dismissing them. Recognize that failure in one context might constitute capability in another. Share knowledge despite institutional resistance or hierarchical barriers. The radio broke. The operator noticed. The Navy adapted. And electromagnetic warfare emerged to reshape conflicts throughout the century that followed. If this chronicle revealed how innovation often arrives wearing failure's disguise, share it, because recognizing possibility within malfunction, capability within breakdown, represents wisdom that transforms not merely technology, but human understanding itself.